Any academic discipline has a body of core ideas that it can draw upon in making decisions. This is very true when it comes to practical macroeconomics. When we're trying to decide what to do if we're the Federal Reserve or the federal government with regard to the long run or the short run growth of the economy, we should be able to draw upon some ideas that have been shown to work over time and to be true over time, to be true across countries. What I want to do in this module is go through some of these core ideas that we believe are true in macroeconomics. Now, the ones that would be in microeconomics that you would learn about in your course in economics for decision making are a little more secure in that economists have found over many, many decades that the ideas that underlie microeconomics are correct. The importance of incentive, the nature of price, the nature of markets, the nature of market failure, all these are well established and can be a guide to decision making. In macroeconomics, unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of only dealing with a single decision maker, a person or a firm. We have to deal with an economy as a whole. And what I want to do is look at some of these core ideas that have existed in the United States and many other countries. Let's begin with the question, where will an economy be in, say, 10 years? So what I'm asking is, what is it that drives an economy in the long run? And what we know is that over time, an economy is driven by the supply side. The movement in the economy depends upon the nature of the production process, the level of technology, the inputs, labor, capital, resources, how they're organized, how they're used. In addition to that, we have to have saving to put aside to get the capital that we need to grow over time. Now, what we have found is that we can generally tell a country's trajectory in the long run by looking at the sum of three numbers. If we would add up the growth rate of the labor force, how many people you're going to have that will be available to produce things. To this, if we add the growth rate of productivity, that is, how much output will these inputs make for every hour that they're worked. And lastly, changes in the hours worked. So you could have a situation where you don't have new people, but everybody who is working works longer. This would give us a bigger output. So this rule of thumb is that potential GDP over time is the sum of three numbers. Change in the labor force, plus change in the growth rate of productivity, plus changes in hours worked. Now, looking at some specifics, if you were to ask me, where will the Czech Republic be in 10 years? I would then want to ask a series of questions regarding these important supply side factors. For example, what is the size and the quality of the labor force? Now, by quality, I mean their education, essentially. Now, don't think of education always in the academic sense. Of course, education could be that they are taught to be a truck driver, a welder, a professor, a doctor. Societies need all these different people. So what you want to have is a group of people. Of course, you need people to start, but you could have many people who are poorly educated and don't or have education which doesn't meet the needs of the society, and growth will not occur. So I will always ask, what is the level of the population's growth rate? What is the level of education? And does this education meet the needs of the society? And if it does, then I would say a society with more people or better educated people will be a society that grows faster. Secondly, I have to look at the machines that these people work with. This would be referred to as capital. Do they have the latest technology, or are they dealing with machines which are 30, 40, or 50 years old? Now, 50-year-old machines may be just fine if you're doing certain tasks. A saw is a saw, but that is not true if you're dealing with computers or certain processes to make steel or other kinds of metals. So I'd always want to know what is true of the level of capital stock. Do you have a sufficient level for the workers to work with? And is it of the latest and best possible technology? Third, I need to find out if people are saving enough money to buy this kind of capital. The saving rate in an economy can be either too low, too high, or just right. If you don't save enough, you won't put enough aside in the form of capital, and you won't have the machines and the inventory and so forth with which to build in the future. If you save too much, you'll just have a lot of idle resources sitting around factories empty because there are no people and there's no need for that excess capital. But if you can get the savings amount just right, put just the right amount aside in terms of inventories, plant and equipment and so forth, then you'll have an economy that grows well. Next, you want to have an economy that is transparent to the investors. Now, what we mean by transparency is simply that it is clear what is happening in society, that things are not hidden in the form of corruption. So a transparent society would be where the policymakers are in the open, so that you could go and watch what is happening, or at least read about what is happening. This would be true, for example, with our Congress, where everything is on C-SPAN, or with our Federal Reserve. While those meetings are not open to all of us, we certainly get to see the minutes, and we get the reports from them, and we have to accept them as working in the best interest of the country. But it's transparent what they are doing. They do it through, the Fed does their actions through the bond market. We can see expressly what it is they're doing. Secondly, there's a concept in finance called disclosure, and that's the idea that companies are required to tell us what is going on inside the company if it is a publicly traded company. Now, private companies need not do this. A private company doesn't have to tell anybody anything about their finances. But you see, what happens in most growing economies is that you have publicly traded firms with a actively traded stock market. Any company that enters this actively traded market must disclose certain things about its profits, its sales, its management, and its activities. A society that allows firms to hide behind certain financial statements is one which will not grow nearly as quickly. The next thing is, you want to have a country, if you can, that has natural resources, that has a solid transportation system, and that has a solid communication system. These, again, are supply-sided, supply-related, production-related factors that drive an economy. Now, of course, we can't have an economy that has all of these. You could have, in terms of these three, natural resources, communication, and so forth, you may have a country which is landlocked, and therefore it has no easy way of moving things out of the country in terms of water. Let's have something like Hong Kong. Here's a location where there is very minimal land that can be used to specifically do things like build factories and make steel, or waves and waves of grain and soybeans and corn, because it's mainly mountainous. Well, what a country does when it has these kinds of resources, the natural resources that work against them, is that they will go into activities that match their natural resource abilities. So that's why you would find a place like Hong Kong would be very much involved in activities related to insurance and banking and finance, because that's what their natural resources allow them to do. With one exception, they have a very good natural resource in that they have deep water harbors. And therefore, one thing that Hong Kong has done for that part of the world and for the People's Republic of China has been the entrepot of the world, that they can take things from the mainland, bring it into Hong Kong, and ship it all over the world, because they do have this natural resource. But maybe more important than that is that any society, if it's going to grow over time, requires entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are the risk takers. These are the people. They're not labor. They're not managers. Entrepreneurs are the people who bring together the other factors of production. They put their own resources at risk to open a new business, and they go out and they hire labor. They buy capital. They buy resources. They find the latest technology. They put them together, and they offer their services or their goods to the market. They take the chance. Without this entrepreneurial spark, an economy cannot grow. And if you have a society that squashes entrepreneurial activity through red tape or some kind of governmental control, growth will not be nearly as high. Even if you have entrepreneurs, however, the very last aspect I want to talk about in this long-run growth rate, while it's last, it maybe is most important, and that is, a society can grow if and only if it protects property rights. There would be no need or no reason for a laborer to go to work if they knew that the government at any time could take all of their wages. It would make no sense for an entrepreneur to start a new business if that entrepreneur knew that, either through confiscatory taxes or actions of the government where they could nationalize this new idea, where people could come in and take your capital, take your intellectual capital. So what we see is the protection of property rights through a very transparent court system is absolutely essential. So the long run is driven by the supply side. Now, you would think then what we can do is simply look at the supply side in the short run, and we would know exactly where the economy is going. And we find that that's not quite true. In fact, we see that in the short run, the best way to describe the economy, to understand what it is doing and where it is going to go in the short run, which I'll define here as over the next 6 quarters or a year and a half, is to focus on the demand side, to focus on spending. And the spending is generally summarized by the four components of gross domestic product. And if you remember, those four are consumption by households, spending by firms called investment, government spending on goods and services, and net exports. By analyzing these four activities, we can tell whether an economy is growing or receding. We can tell where the strength is. We can tell whether it is a recession buried in activities of corporations, or is it that households have drawn back on their purchase of durables? Could it be that the economy is growing only because the government is spending a lot? Or could you have a country where without exports, the country cannot grow? Now, that's not true of the US, for example. The foreign sector is not as important as it is in other countries, but in many countries, Hong Kong, Czech Republic, Switzerland, and so forth, without trade, the economy would stall. So what you can tell is in the short run, you can tell where an economy is going by focusing upon these aggregate spending indicators: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Now, we do know that if we're looking for fluctuations or changes in the movement of the economy in the short run, we would probably find this information in variables that tend to be unstable. Now, see, certain parts of consumption, for example, the consumption of services, are relatively stable. If you look at it through growth and through recessions, you will see very little variation. It just tends to go in a nice, smooth path. But if you look at things called durables, houses and cars and furniture and appliances for those homes, you'll find a great deal of variability there, so that in good times, people will buy these things when they have the money and the jobs. And in bad times, where their job is in jeopardy or they don't have the income, they won't buy these things. So by watching the spending on durables, we can generally determine whether or not the economy is going up or down. The same thing is true on the investment side. If you remember, investment is comprised in our discussion of three things: plant and equipment, changes in inventory, and the building of new homes. So by watching home building, by watching whether companies are building inventories, by watching whether corporations are building plant and equipment, we can tell whether the economy is rising or falling. Because it will be these three components of investment, all three components, that will rise and fall, which could take the economy with it. So what we do in business cycle analysis is that we watch most predominantly movements in consumption of durables and movements in all three components of the investment sector. Now let's look at our third core principle. Could we take these ideas I was talking about regarding the supply side and move them into the short run to determine the direction of the economy in the short run? The reason I have to ask this question is that there's an entire portion of the macro discipline that believes this is the case. And some of you who may have a background in macro may have been taught by a professor who believes this particular aspect of it. Now, in this course, I'm more concerned about practical macro, real-world applied macro, as opposed to theoretical macro. Now, theoretically, the ideas that the supply side drives the economy all the time is certainly arguable. And if I were pushed, I could give you the argument that explains exactly what they say, and I could make it sound convincing. I just don't happen to buy it in terms of its application to the real world. And we've tried over and over, and it's been a failure. When you try to apply the micro-sided ideas by looking at changes in either technology or changes in labor force decisions, and use that as a way of forecasting changes in gross domestic product in the short run, it simply fails. We have much more luck, though not perfection, in forecasting changes in the economy by focusing upon consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So we will focus our attention in the short run part of this course, which is pretty much all of it, on the spending side. C plus I plus G plus NX, looking at the details, looking at the price called interest, looking at exchange rates, and so forth. So this alternative, real business cycle theory, has been a failure when it comes to practical macroeconomics. Now, any economy can be plagued by two real big problems, and those two problems are unemployment or inflation. Now, one thing we have observed over time is that unemployment and inflation are related to each other in the short run in the following way. We tend to find that as an economy gets stronger and stronger, and the labor market is approaching what we would call full employment, If you try to grow faster than that, the inflation rate begins to rise. If you have an economy that was growing smartly, and all of a sudden it begins to stall and fall into recession, and you see the unemployment rate beginning to rise, invariably you will find that inflationary pressures disappear. In fact, we may get into what is called disinflation, where the inflation rate actually begins to fall. This inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation around the time of full employment is an important concept that economists often draw upon. Now, here's where we have one problem in the macro. It is a core idea in that economists accept this inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation near full employment. But the problem is trying to make it mathematical and put it into the models. There's where we have the problem. It is very difficult to know exactly when the inflationary pressures will pick up. We do know it is going to be somewhere near full employment, but we don't know that exact rate of unemployment. There's the problem. Secondly, we don't know exactly by how much inflation may rise. It may rise a little or a lot depending upon monetary policy. So what you will see, the reason this makes practical core idea important is that when the Federal Reserve is doing its monetary policy, you will often hear in its arguments for changing interest rates that they have become concerned about inflation because of what is happening in the labor market. During the growing period of the late 1990s, the American economy was booming and unemployment approached 4%. We had what would be called full employment. And very often during that time, the Federal Reserve would observe the labor market data of booming job creation. And based upon that information, they became concerned that inflation may pick up, and they began to raise interest rates to slow the economy down some, to keep this inflationary pressure and inflationary expectations under control. Now, the Fed does not have a model which gives them explicitly the numbers that they could rely upon to say, I should raise interest rates exactly this much, or inflation will move exactly that much. But we do know this basic practical core idea that unemployment and inflation in the short run tend to move opposite each other. Now, when you're looking at something like this, unemployment and inflation moving inversely in the short run, you must think, well, if it's in the short run, it's probably true in the long run. And in fact, you would be wrong. And that's one thing also, it's not exactly a core idea, but let's keep it in mind, and that is that the short run is not the long run. The short run is different. Just like we saw that the long run is driven by the supply side, the short run is driven by the demand side. In the short run, unemployment and inflation move inversely, but we have found statistically in country after country that unemployment and inflation are not related to each other in the long run. Inflation will be driven ultimately by only one thing, the growth rate of the money supply in relation to the growth rate of the economy. If you print too much money, over time you will get rising prices. If you print too little money, over time you will get falling prices. It will be irrelevant whether unemployment is high or low in this case. The unemployment rate will vary over time depending upon the labor market decisions of households. If people will work or retire, enter early or stay in school, all these different decisions by households to work or not to work will ultimately affect the unemployment rate. That along with the productivity of the people. So what you could see happening over time is that you put people into colleges, which will lower the unemployment rate in the short run, but it will make a better, more productive labor force in the long run. This is what will affect the rate of unemployment. It will not necessarily be affected by the level of inflation. So we find that inflation and unemployment are not connected in the long run. Next thing is, let's take a look at the money supply. And here again we have this dichotomy between the short run and the long run. One of the most important institutions in the country, in almost any country, is the central bank. And the central bank goes about what is called monetary policy, which we'll cover later in the course. And in this monetary policy, they will tend to manipulate interest rates and monetary conditions as a means of changing the direction of the economy. Well, if their actions could have no effects upon the real economy in the form of real GDP, then they shouldn't bother doing this. So the question is, does a change in the money supply and or the interest rate that is related to this money supply, can it fundamentally change the real economy, real gross domestic product, real interest rates, real wages? And the answer is yes. And this is why central banks are so important. What we say in the literature is that the money in the short run is non-neutral, which means it has an effect upon the economy. If the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates at a time where the economy is beginning to stall, this may be just what is needed to prop the economy up and get it growing towards its potential. If an economy is growing too quickly and the Federal Reserve decides to raise interest rates several times to get the attention that we can't have this because we may lead towards inflation, then the Fed will have an effect. They will raise interest rates high enough that economic activity will slow down. So we're going to argue that money in the short run is non-neutral. This is why, again, central banks are so very important in the operation of any economy. But here again, just because money matters in the short run does not mean that money in of itself can change the level of real variables in the long run. In fact, we're going to argue, based upon history and our discipline, that money in the long run is neutral. Now, what I mean by that is not that it doesn't matter. It does matter. You need money to make exchanges efficient. But if you print too much money over time, you will not grow faster. You will simply have inflation. If you print too little money over time, you won't necessarily grow less quickly. You will simply have deflation. You cannot become a wealthy nation by printing money. You can only become a wealthy nation through production, through entrepreneurial activities, through the protection of property rights, and all the things I listed in the very first core principle. Money is simply a means to make efficient exchange over time. It is not a means by which a country becomes rich. So, money is neutral in the long run. Now, our very last one, core principle. Money plays a role here. And I want to look at the question of inflation. Because in many countries, you will see inflation sometimes is very low for decades on end, and then all of a sudden it can be very high. You can have countries which experience something called hyperinflation. Or you could have countries which experience inflation, which is not real high, but it just goes on year after year after year. What we do know from our core understanding of economies over time is that the only ultimate determinant of whether or not you're going to have inflation over time is money. If you print too much money in relation to the growth of the real economy, you'll get inflation. If you print just the right amount of money to make exchange efficient in that growing economy, let's say, to use simple numbers, if the economy is growing at 3% a year for 10 years, and you allow the money supply to grow at roughly 3% a year over those 10 years, you will observe minimal to no inflation. If you print more than that 3%, you will have some inflation. If you print no extra money, which means you don't have the means to carry out these exchanges efficiently, the only thing that can happen is you will have falling prices. You will not necessarily have an economy that grows more slowly or less slowly, because money, of course, again, is neutral in the long run. But money will change one thing over time. It will explain persistent inflation, or it will explain hyperinflation, because inflation is ultimately rooted in there being too much money. Now, much of the rest of the course is going to be exploring some of these issues. We're going to focus mainly upon the short run, because that's where most of us spend our time, and this is what is of interest to most decision makers. The Fed, the federal government, businesses want to know where are we going to be over the next 18 months.